Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. She kept saying the baby was a blessing, but when the townspeople asked who the father was, she just stared, silent, eyes hollow, lips trembling. There were rumors, of course, the kind that curdle the stomach, that it was her brother, or her father, or both. No one dared say it out loud, but everyone knew. In the hills just beyond town, nestled deep in the woods where the sun barely reached, lived a family so isolated, so warped by generations of secrecy, their very name was spoken like a curse. This is not just a story about inbreeding. It's about the slow rot of a bloodline collapsing in on itself, and what happens when truth festers for too long in the dark. They were called the Merricks, a forgotten surname in the Appalachians, one that had no traceable lineage beyond the 1800s. The earliest records, if you can call them that, were barely legible scribbles in a Bible too stained to read. Births with no fathers listed, children who came into the world unnamed. The Merricks never registered for schools, never married legally, never left. They lived in a collapsing farmhouse tucked between two hollows, surrounded by rusted cars and bone-white animal skeletons. Locals said it smelled like something dead was always just beneath the porch. What made the Merricks different wasn't just their isolation, it was their refusal to acknowledge the outside world. They didn't come to town except when absolutely necessary, and when they did, they came in pairs. Always silent, eyes down, limbs moving strangely, like their bones didn't sit quite right under their skin. Doctors in town whispered of birth defects too extreme to speak of. One of the boys, the youngest, had webbed fingers. Another was said to be blind, but still moved as though he saw through the walls. But it was the girl, Emmeline, that people remembered. Pale, raven-haired, and too quiet for a child. By the time she turned 16, her stomach had begun to swell. No one had seen her with a boy. No one ever would. When the sheriff asked her gently who the father was, she looked at him like he'd asked about the sky. "He's inside me," she said. "He always has been." The pregnancy didn't spark outrage, only fear. The town had long since given up on intervening in the Merricks' affairs. They were a cursed family, the locals said. God's punishment walking upright. But this was different. Emmeline's growing belly was not just a scandal, it was a warning. Something unnatural was being born up there in the hills. Some locals still remembered the story from decades earlier, whispered during storms and blackout nights, that the Merricks didn't just marry their cousins, they bred within immediate bloodlines, brother to sister, father to daughter, over and over again. And now, this child, this unborn thing, was the culmination of that legacy, the final spiral of the bloodline collapsing on itself. Rumors multiplied like flies. People said the father wasn't one of the boys. They said it was the old man, Emmeline's father, or maybe grandfather. The problem was, no one knew for sure who he even was. He was ancient, withered, barely human, a half-blind patriarch who hadn't left the property in over 20 years. But somehow, he still ruled that household. Women did not speak in his presence. The boys never looked him in the eye. And yet he was the center of their universe, a decaying god presiding over a crumbling kingdom. When Emmeline was 8, a state social worker made the long, muddy drive up the mountain. Her body was never found. A few scraps of clothing washed up in the creek that year, but nothing else. After that, the county quietly closed the case. No more visits, no more questions. Everyone understood the message. So, when Emmeline became pregnant, there was no investigation, no DNA tests, no protective services. The town clerk wrote "Father Unknown" on the birth record and folded it shut. The doctor who delivered the baby didn't speak of it for 10 years, until he drank himself into a coma and was found in a ditch with a notepin, nailed to his chest. "There are some children God never meant to be born." That child's name was never made public. The Merricks never registered him, but those who saw him said he was wrong. Wrong in ways that couldn't be explained by science or sympathy. He didn't cry. He didn't blink. His eyes were too far apart, and his limbs seemed to bend backward when he crawled. They said he looked at you the way a predator does, quiet, patient, already knowing how you'll die. By the time the child was 5, the Merrick house had become completely cut off. No electricity, no phone line, no vehicles seen on the path leading in or out. It was as if the forest had reclaimed them, swallowed their sins back into the dirt. But Emmeline would still be seen from time to time, not in town but at the tree line, watching, holding the boy's hand. Locals swore she never spoke, never waved, just stood there in the fog like a shadow trying to remember what sunlight felt like. And always, the boy beside her, barefooted, pale as bone, unmoving, as if he'd grown roots right where he stood. There were whispers again, that the child could hear voices no one else could, that he didn't age right. Some said he was 6, going on 60, speaking in riddles about things he couldn't possibly know, local deaths, tragedies, even secrets buried decades ago. One hunter who wandered too close to the property line said the boy appeared behind him without making a sound and simply said, "Your father was crying when he died, under the barn." The hunter's father had indeed hanged himself there in 1982. The man never hunted again. More than one neighbor reported strange noises echoing from the Merrick property at night. Not screams, something worse. Chanting, low, guttural, almost inhuman, a cadence that didn't match any language, but burrowed into the mind like rot. One man described it as a sermon meant for something not of this world. He moved away the next week. And yet, the authorities did nothing. The town had grown used to living beside something they didn't understand. It was easier to pretend, easier to lock your doors and tell your children never to go near the woods. But then, one fall, the forest caught fire. No one knows how it started. There was no lightning, no campfires, no wind. Just one day, the smoke appeared over the ridge. Fire crews hiked into the hill and found a scene that defied logic. The Merrick home was untouched, completely spared. Everything around it, acres of forest, was ash and bone, but the house stood still, unburnt, and no one, not a single soul, was found inside. Emmeline, the boy, the old man, they had vanished. For weeks, search parties combed the hills. Bloodhounds were brought in, but they refused to cross the burned threshold of the Merrick land. Volunteers reported sudden nosebleeds, nausea, and vivid hallucinations when nearing the house. One deputy claimed he heard someone humming an old hymn from beneath the floorboards, only to find the cellar sealed shut with rusted chains. Another man, a war veteran, ran screaming into the woods, insisting the boy had spoken to him from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come back. You belong to us now." He was found days later in a tree, his fingernails torn out, eyes open but seeing nothing. Eventually, the town gave up. The sheriff filed the family as missing under unknown circumstances. The property was declared condemned, and a makeshift fence was built around it. But everyone knew the truth. They hadn't disappeared. They had become something else. The fire had not been an accident. It was a cleansing. Nature's last attempt to purge what had been festering for generations. But it failed, because the house still stood, and deep in its walls, something remained. About a year later, a group of urban explorers found their way up there. Teenagers with cameras chasing clout and fear. The footage they captured was only partially recovered. Static heavy, flickering in and out, but unmistakably real. In one frame, the camera catches a figure in the attic window, small, pale, eyes reflecting like an animal's. In another, the girl filming whispers, "There's something under the floor. I can hear breathing." The last few seconds are nothing but her screaming. The tape ends with a thud. She was never seen again. The other two were found wandering the highway 6 miles away, barefoot, in shock. When questioned, they wouldn't speak of what they saw. One just kept repeating a single phrase. He wasn't born. He was summoned. After that, the Merrick house was finally bulldozed, or tried to be, because when the construction team arrived, the foundation had sunk, vanished, leaving only a crater. No concrete, no beams, no remnants of a structure ever having existed, just scorched earth and the faint smell of something sweet and rotting. They say the bloodline ended that year, but others say it only went underground. Years passed. The Merrick name faded from memory, spoken only by the oldest residents who refused to go near the woods. The official story was clean, simple, easy to swallow. An isolated family, victims of poverty and mental illness, consumed by the wilderness they tried to outlast. But anyone who looked deeper, anyone who read the sealed court records, the redacted coroner's reports, the censored newspaper clippings, knew better. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cover-up. The state had buried what it couldn't explain, not just for the public's safety, but for its sanity. Because there were still signs. Farmers along the tree line began finding strange symbols carved into their livestock, spiral patterns, crossed circles, marks that bled but didn't heal. One man discovered an entire row of his cornfield had been flattened into a perfect shape, a ring 20 feet wide. When he stepped inside it, his nose began to bleed. His ears rang for 3 days, and every night afterward he dreamed of a boy without a face, whispering through the walls of his house. Then there were the disappearances, small ones, quiet ones, a hiker here, a vagrant there, spread out, spaced over years, but they always circled back to the same ridge, the place where the Merrick house had once stood. GPS signals failed in that stretch of forest, phones died suddenly, compasses spun, and if you stood very still, the locals claimed, you could hear something moving just beneath the soil, as if the land was breathing. And then came the child. He arrived in town one rainy morning, barefoot, shivering, covered in mud, no ID, no name, just handed over to social services by a trucker who found him wandering the shoulder of Route 12. The boy was 8, maybe, but his eyes were ancient. He didn't speak for 2 months. When he finally did, it was to ask one question. "Do you know who I am?" The caseworker assigned to him lasted 3 days. She resigned without explanation and moved across the country. The second caseworker claimed he would sit in corners and murmur to someone who wasn't there. He knew names of people he'd never met, knew things he shouldn't. One night, he drew a picture of a farmhouse in crayon, the Merrick house, down to the broken porch swing and the rusted car beside it. But it had never been shown to him. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By the time the boy was placed in a foster home, it was already too late. The damage wasn't just emotional, it was ancestral. His presence alone changed the atmosphere around him. Pets refused to enter his room. Crosses fell off the walls. The other children in the home began sleepwalking, waking up in the woods behind the house with mud on their feet and blood under their nails. The foster father, a well-meaning man in his 40s, was found one morning standing in the kitchen, carving spirals into the refrigerator with a steak knife. He didn't respond to his name, only stared forward and whispered, "He's waking up again." The boy had never spoken those words aloud, but they were the exact phrase Emmeline had said before giving birth. Psychologists tried to diagnose him, schizophrenia, psychopathy, trauma-induced catatonia, but no label fit, no treatment helped. He never aged right. At 10, he still had the same face as the day he arrived, unchanged, untouched by time. His teeth hadn't fallen out, his hair never grew, and yet he was aware of people in ways that made them uncomfortable, aware of memories they hadn't shared. One therapist noted that during a session, the boy looked at her and said, "Your brother was in the car, not you." She had never spoken of the accident, not to anyone. The foster home was eventually shut down after a fire broke out in the middle of the night. No arson was detected, no electrical faults, just fire in the shape of a perfect ring around the boy's bed. He wasn't burned, not even a mark. He was found standing outside, watching the flames, smiling softly, whispering a name no one understood. Papau. The state moved him to a psychiatric facility, high security, cameras in every room. 2 weeks later, the lead nurse hung herself in the supply closet. The footage showed her staring into his room for 3 full hours before she moved. No blinking, no movement, just stillness. And in the last frame before the camera cut out, the boy was no longer in bed. He was standing at the glass, eyes locked on the lens, smiling. The Merricks were gone, yes, but they left something behind. Not just blood, not just memory, but intent. A curse passed down not by words or rituals, but by being born. He wasn't just the last of the bloodline, he was its final purpose. He was moved again, this time to a black site, government-run, off-books, a place meant for things the public was never meant to know, the kind of facility where names don't exist, only numbers. He became 067B, no file photo, no visitors, no record in public databases, just a locked door behind a locked door, and men in suits who didn't believe in ghosts, until they met him. It said the boy stopped speaking entirely once he arrived, not out of fear, out of boredom, as if he'd already seen everything that would happen. The staff rotated every week, standard protocol for cases involving psychological degradation. But even in short exposure, people changed. Some became withdrawn, others developed tremors. One man lost all sense of time and began aging rapidly, hair graying, teeth loosening, liver spots blooming across his skin. He died of organ failure at 38. When they tried to scan his brain, the machines failed, not once, every time. Signals scrambled, metal warped, lights flickered. One technician claimed the images that did come through were not human. "It was like trying to map a storm," he said. "Not a brain, something moving, shifting, feeding on attention itself." The boy never resisted, never attacked. He didn't have to. Those who guarded him began to worship him in secret. At first it was small, notes slipped under his door, offerings of food arranged in strange shapes. But then came the tattoos, spirals on wrists, inverted crosses. One man carved "He Who Remains" into his own chest. They were discharged quietly. No one spoke of it again. Eventually the boy vanished from the facility. One day his room was empty, no breach, no footage, no signs of struggle, just a wet handprint on the ceiling, inverted, like something had crawled out rather than in. The case was closed as an internal administrative reclassification. The files were sealed. He room was demolished, but some of the staff kept talking, mostly after they left government service. One was interviewed anonymously in a podcast that's since been deleted from every platform. He said, "The child wasn't human. He was an echo, a ripple from something older, something that used that inbred bloodline as a doorway. And now that doorway is open. They say he's still out there, somewhere. Not a man, not a boy, something in between. Something waiting." And if you ever dream of a pale child standing at the foot of your bed, whispering in a voice you don't recognize, but somehow understand, you'll know the bloodline never ended. It just changed faces. End.